All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's program. My name's Anissa. I am a librarian at the San Francisco Public Library, and we want to welcome you here today from wherever you're tuning in. And we're happy to have you and join us for this month's Nature Boost. We at San Francisco Public Library would like to acknowledge the unceded land of the Ohlone tribal people and acknowledge the many Ramaytush Ohlone tribal groups and families as the rightful stewards of the lands on which we live and work here in the Bay Area. SFPL is committed to uplifting the names of these lands and community members from these nations with whom we live together. SFPL encourages you to learn more about first-person culture and land rights and are committed to hosting events and providing educational resources on these topics. I'm going to give you a couple announcements about the library's campaigns and upcoming events. We're celebrating our 16th One City, One Book and honoring Chanel Miller for her book, Know My Name, the story of her sexual assault on the Stanford campus and her experience with the judicial system and how she's overcome and survived and what she does now. Amazing artist, amazing woman. She will be in our virtual library on March 16th. So make sure you tune in for that. We have on Thursday, February 25th, our famous Effie Lee Morris lecture, and we'll be featuring Jason Reynolds and the transformative power of reading and writing. So please make sure you tune in for that one as well. We are celebrating our Black History Month, which we call More Than a Month at the library, and it runs from January through February, and celebrating all kinds of amazing people and all kinds of amazing work. And we have lots of events still coming up for that. We want you to know about our local bookstores and that we still support them and that we continue to support them. We would not have the vibrant city we have without these bookstores. And this month we're supporting Borderland Books and Marcus Books, the nation's oldest Black-owned independent bookstore. We love bookstores. And you can find out about More Than a Month and all of those great events on our website. As part of our More Than a Month celebration, today's event is part of. So we would like to acknowledge our partnership with the Golden Gate National Park, the National Park Service, and the Presidio Trust. Someone once called, I'm not sure who coined it, but the rangers are the librarians' soulmates, and I love that. They're almost like the librarians of the natural world. So we have a really great partnership with them and are very honored to continue this partnership. We would like you to know, we'd like you to let us know how you like our programs, and you can type that in the YouTube chat or contact us through the library. This is a proud partnership that we continue and look forward to more events in the future, March, April, May, and summer. So please tune in. Today, we are so happy to have Ranger Hector and Ranger Alanna, both going to be here telling us about Faces of Resistance. And without further ado, our partners.
Thank you for that introduction. So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our presentation, Faces of Resistance. My name is Alanna Smith. I'm the Presidio Education Program Manager, and I'm joined today by my colleague.
Hi, folks. My name is Hector, and I am the Fort Point Education Program Manager, also working at Golden Gate National Recreation Area with Alanna Smith.
Yeah, so we're both with the National Park Service. We're out of San Francisco. And yes, our park is Golden Gate National Recreation Area. And the land of our park really tells the stories of so many different groups of people that have been here before us, starting with the indigenous people of this land, the Ohlone, and then continuing on with folks arriving to the area in various waves of migration, particularly over the past couple hundred years. So in honor of Black History Month, we would like to take a closer look at the contributions of San Francisco's Black Americans and see how they contributed to civil rights activism and how that connected to nationwide efforts. And we're specifically going to be looking at the later 1800s and early 1900s, which I know when you think civil rights movement, usually we're not thinking that far back. But the truth is that even in the 1800s, there were some really remarkable acts of resistance. So it wasn't all, just about slavery and struggle, but some really empowering stories to share. So we're going to be diving into those today, and then also be thinking about how that connects to acts of resistance that we see today in movements. So to get us started, Hector is going to talk about some of those patterns of migration and that early forming of the Black community of San Francisco.
Hi, folks. So if we switch to our first slide here, we're going to be taking a look. We're kind of going to be zooming out, so to speak, a little bit in order for us to focus on our first story, which is the story of the John Harris v. Sutro Baths case. But first, we need to kind of set the scene here, as my colleague has mentioned, to understand the patterns of both voluntary and forced migration of Black people to San Francisco from all the way to from the 1700s to the mid to late 1800s, which is the time period that we are going to be talking about today. So to kind of remind ourselves of some of the earlier migration patterns that we don't often think of, the settlement and colonization of the Bay Area by the Spanish in the 1770s and the late 1700s actually brought a lot of folks who were African descended living in Mexico. So these were people who at one point had been enslaved. They lived in Mexico and they came up on trails such as the Juan Bautista de Anza Trail along with Spanish settlers. So some of the first governors, some of the first alcaldes, like the holders of political power in California, were actually descended partially from indigenous people in Mexico and also partially from African descended folks as well. So it's just something to sort of remind ourselves that people who were of African descent were actually living in parts of the Bay Area in California before people of Anglo or English descent as well. So just something to kind of think of as we go along. We're really trying to set back the timeline on Black settlement into the Bay Area and the West Coast in general. When we look at different types of migration patterns of Black people as well, one of the most interesting ones for me to explore actually is this sort of big purple arrow that we see here going from the East Coast of the United States all the way down to Central America and then up the West Coast to San Francisco. So this would have brought East Coast groups of Black people, such as the New Bedford Whalers and other people who were coming from already existent communities of freed people living on the East Coast of the United States, and even some people who would have been recently freed or, and what they would do is actually they would come down to Central America and cross there down near Panama and then come back up the coast to San Francisco. And actually some Black Americans ended up settling in parts of Panama and Nicaragua. So just sort of expanding again our idea of where Black Americans were during these time periods. We oftentimes get a very narrow view of this from our history books. And so this is when we start to see these waves of settlement happening. Obviously, 1848, 1849 is when we see the gold rush occurring. So this is one of the big pushers for getting people of all races out to California and into San Francisco. In the middle of the continent, I included sort of a land route that was part of a forced migration of Black people to San Francisco and the Bay and gold rush areas as well. And we have to acknowledge the fact that there was a lot of Southerners going to California at the time, and some of these people would have owned enslaved people. So, when we look at the word migration, is problematic because we don't want to look at enslaved people as immigrants, right? There's a forced perspective. There's a forcing going on, so to speak. So that kind of land route, it might not have been as common as we imagine, but there would have been enslaved people working in the gold fields of California. And as this community started to burgeon in San Francisco, not only did it have people who were descended from more prosperous, freed communities in the East Coast. But those people who had that prosperity and were part of a burgeoning Black middle class were also helping people who were formerly enslaved. Some of these enslaved people were actually working in the gold fields to buy their own freedom and then buy the freedom of their families. So a lot of different perspectives that we're looking at throughout time. Let's zoom in now. On the next slide, we're going to take a look at what kind of made a community in San Francisco for Black people. So we have to understand that the neighborhood where Black people would have lived in San Francisco is different than where it is today. So these are some historical photos showing Stockton Street, California Street. So this is kind of like Soma, like actually a Chinatown area. We can see in this first photo on our left, we have that arrow is pointing to the AME Zion Church, which is a Black church. And this photo is taken in 1870. And right down the street, we see the first Presbyterian Chinese church. So there's actually an old book from the 70s called A Walking Tour of Historic Black San Francisco. And Alanna and I did that in our first week working here at Golden Gate National Recreation Area. And we were walking around Chinatown the whole time. And it was, for me, something really interesting to note that like these communities live very closely to one another. The AME Zion Church also had a small school in it called the Livingston Institute. And we're learning more and more about this community every day. Again, it's something that you have to dig quite a lot in. I'm going to be citing some researchers later and some of the shoulders that we stand on when we look at this information. But it's important to note that before the 1906 earthquake, and basically from like the 1870s until like the early 1900s, one of the centers of the Black community in San Francisco was this area, Clay Street, Stockton Street, kind of like Soma area. And this picture on the right here that we see is one of my favorite pictures. I just found it recently. It's sourced from the Bancroft Library and actually is part of this big document called the SF City Planning African American Citywide Historic Context Statement, which is a long document full of lovely information. And it has this photo of, we can see this Black family here on Clay Street towards Stockton. Some things that stand out for me is like seeing people in like relatively nice clothes, like, enjoying a social event. I think it's really important for us when we approach conversations of resistance that people were fighting a fight for a life worth living. There was so many things happening in this community, social organizations, communities being formed, people dancing together, having relationships, forming bonds over time. And so it's just fascinating to me to look back in time and see a community that was very different. And so I also want to acknowledge that the Black community in San Francisco is in different places today. So the Fillmore, what's now known as the Western Addition, and the Bayview, those are really some of the big centers of Black community today. This is what we're looking at in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So what are really the pillars or foundations of this community? And the next slide, we'll get into that a little bit. And so we're going to look at some of the roots of political resistance in the mid to late 1800s. And really what we find is that there's kind of three things that stand out, particularly for me, is that community resistance required business and financing, money to be able to support what was happening. They needed community organizations, so people who were willing to kind of get the community together to decide on a common goal. And they needed the press, and particularly the Black press had a big impact on San Francisco, and it was able to link different communities all around the country. And so in terms of business and financing here, I put up Mary Ellen Pleasant, a woman who actually has a park named after her in San Francisco. It is the smallest park in the city. It's not under the National Park Service, but I have yet to go see it. I need to go and check it out. Mary Ellen Pleasant's life, I could talk about her all day. Very interesting woman. Her origins are not very well known. She was either a bondsperson in the North, which is essentially a form of kind of shorter term enslavement that was happening. Or she could have also come from Georgia as well. There are different sources that indicate where she came from. At the end of the day, she was a light-skinned Black woman who lived in San Francisco, and she became a very prominent businesswoman and abolitionist in the 1850s. So just to kind of set up the timeline for us, before 1863, Black people could not legally testify in court in San Francisco, and Black people were not permitted to vote until 1870. But Mary Ellen Pleasant set herself up as a domestic worker in houses in prominent homes in San Francisco and was able to kind of glean information and learn how to invest the money that she was making into businesses that were needed in the community. So this meant boarding houses, laundries. In the last slide that we looked at, actually, there was that picture of AME Zion Church. Right on that street, Mary Ellen Pleasant had a boarding house that she owned. And Mary Ellen Pleasant used funds from her business ventures to support abolitionism and the early civil rights movement as well. So we know that she sent money back east, possibly for a variety of abolitionist movements. There's a connection between her and John Brown, who obviously led the John Brown Harper's Ferry resistance of enslaved people against their enslavers. It's sort of an interesting connection. We know that she may have donated some money to him, although the value of the money we're not entirely sure. There's some people that put it up all the way to $30,000, which is a lot back then. But at the end of the day, she was responsible for funding abolitionist movement. She would oftentimes give formerly enslaved people work in her boarding houses. She was really using her finances to try to prop up this nascent Black community in San Francisco. Community organizations were an incredibly important part of the community, whether it was schools, churches, political organizations like the Afro-American League. These organizations were really responsible for activating the Black political voice before voting was legal. And they would oftentimes be a part of these big congregations that would go out to the state capitol and advocate for anti-discrimination laws so that Black people could have more access to public space and public commerce as well. And Theophilus Morton was the president of the Afro-American League. We're going to be touching on another community organization that actually helped John Harris as well later on in our presentation. The Black press was incredibly important. Philip Alexander Bell was a renowned journalist, and he was the editor of The Elevator, which was a big Black newspaper during this time period in San Francisco. We don't actually have any Black newspapers that I know of that reference John Harris, so you'll notice those newspapers we look at are going to be generally like white San Francisco kind of city newspapers. But we do know that the impact of newspapers like The Elevator was connecting this network of Black communities all throughout California and even back east with one another, and keeping that net of communication and resistance going. As we move to our next slide, we're going to kind of learn a little bit about the fact that these cases, this case of John Harris versus Sutro Baths, these test cases, these civil rights cases, were not living in a vacuum. As I mentioned before, you needed a community to sustain this resistance and this resilience over time. And really, I think when we set the timetable back on civil rights in the United States, we have to look at the case of Charlotte Brown, who Elaine Ellenson references in her article. Elaine is a big researcher. Shout out to her. I hope she's in the crowd today. And I use a lot of her works in this presentation as well. But we can look at Charlotte Brown as a sort of Rosa Parks of San Francisco, in the sense that, again, she didn't just sit down on a bus and move things forward, but she had the support of a community as well. So the story of Charlotte Brown, I'm going to keep it short, is she was actually trying to get picked up by a streetcar in what today would be the Marina, down on like Filbert Street, I think. And the conductor of the streetcar asked her to get off. She wasn't permitted to ride any longer. And he cited that it was because she was a colored woman, a Black woman. And so Charlotte Brown filed a lawsuit with the support of her father as well. And she was able to galvanize the community and actually eventually won that lawsuit. Again, these lawsuits, when they would be won, there wouldn't be a lot of financial recompensation, but she started a trend. And also 1863, as I mentioned before, was the first year that Black people could testify legally in courts in California. So she was taking advantage of the time period, this kind of this freedom that had been earned by her predecessors. And now she was using it in order to continue this pattern of resistance throughout time. Later on, Mary Ellen Pleasant would actually sue the Omnibus Railroad Company as well. And so there was a lot of folks kind of chipping in within the Black community to push forward this resistance in a legal sense. And remember, this was during the Civil War, and Black women were already standing up against racial discrimination out west and all over the country as well. So in our next slide, we are going to get to the story that went down at Sutro Baths in 1897. So we're kind of jumping forward in time about 30 years, but there's still a lot of discriminatory laws to deal with. At this point, Black people can legally testify in court. Black men can vote. Black men can vote in state elections and in federal elections as well in California. But there is still a fight left to fight. And when we look at Sutro Baths today, oftentimes what we see is this beautiful area on a rugged coast, and we don't see any indication as much of what was there. We kind of see what might have been these large pools. But Sutro Baths was an incredibly huge, like, swimming facility that could fit up to 10,000 people. And today, when we look at this site, we often admire it for its natural beauty. But I hope the next time that you go down there, you can look at Sutro Baths as a site of a fight for civil rights in 1897. There's actually a plaque down there that tells the story of John Harris v. Sutro Baths. And I have to shout out again to Elaine Ellenson, one of the researchers that really did a lot of work to find the story of John Harris versus Sutro Baths, and Lynn Fonfa as well, the former education specialist who pushed forward interpretation and education on this man and on the connection of him to the greater Black community and the struggle for resistance as well. So if we go to our next slide here, again, we see these pictures of Sutro Baths. It was a really huge facility, probably the only colored photo that you'll see of Sutro Baths or of any, but this is the only colored photo that we have in this presentation, basically. I just wanted to give y'all a little bit of like brightness here. So, you know, it would have been this huge complex. It was built in 1896, and it was, the pools were like, in a sense, like climate controlled, like temperature controlled. There was people coming from all over the state, all over the country to go and be in these baths and be in these pools. And there was also kind of an entertainment complex as well. So you could go and eat in a restaurant, you could go and eat, see like a museum of different things from all around the world. And there was streetcar connections that would take people from downtown and different kind of farther away parts of San Francisco and bring them out to Sutro Baths, which is very far away from things at the time. And also in the background of this first photo on the left, we can see Adolf Sutro's mansion. Adolf Sutro was the person who built Sutro Baths. He was also a former mayor of San Francisco. So he had this big mansion that kind of overlooked his empire, so to speak. And so I say here, fun for all, because even though Sutro Baths was made in this very egalitarian way, this way of like, we're going to create a space where everyone can come and enjoy, that was not the experience that John Harris had. So the story of John Harris goes that in 1897, he came to visit Sutro Baths first on July 4th and then on July 11th. On July 4th, he came with a group of white friends, and he was able to pay his admission, which was 25 cents at the time. His admission would give him access not only to the stores and the kind of activities to do inside of Sutro Baths, but also would give him access to the actual bath so he could go swimming. He was turned away from using the bathing facilities, so he's not able to get to enjoy the same privileges that his white colleagues were able to enjoy with their 25 cents. So he left and he came back again on July 11th and had a similar experience. Even though he was more than willing to pay his admission, he was turned away. And so if we switch to our next slide here, we can kind of understand, we can get to understand what is it that John Harris did when he was faced with this discrimination. He was told that he wasn't permitted to go into this space because of the color of his skin. And so on August 1st, he filed a lawsuit against Sutro Baths. Now I have a photo here of Adolf Sutro in the middle, and a couple of, once again, a lot of the information that we're getting is coming from newspaper clips, from these primary sources that are really important for us to understand throughout time. And so some of these newspaper clips kind of reference what John Harris was fighting for, which was civil rights. So he's, you know, they're kind of citing he was refused admission, et cetera, what I had explained. And he had filed suit on August 1st. And the way that Sutro Baths actually kind of defended their position on this, they didn't really cite any sort of legal precedent or anything like that. And they actually would have been expected at this time to at least have separate facilities for Black people. So if anyone knows the Plessy v. Ferguson court case, that happened in 1896. So a year later, there was already a precedent for having separate spaces for white and Black people to be. That was obviously not provided to John Harris, but Plessy v. Ferguson was not even really cited because the defense from Edgar Sutro, the manager of Sutro Baths and also the son of Adolf Sutro, was that it would be ruinous. Now I'm going to use this word in a historical context. I would not use this word normally, to allow Negroes in the baths because the white people would be unwilling to mingle with them. And there were not enough colored people to justify separate baths for them. This is essentially the legal argument that the Sutro family's lawyers had. It wasn't really based in a precedent, and they didn't want to go with the decision of Plessy v. Ferguson, which made it so that they had to have separate facilities, because that meant that they would be providing facilities for people they feel weren't going to use the baths, or they didn't want to waste money, so to speak, on providing a space for Black people to go and bathe and swim. And so with this as their legal argument, John Harris was able to use his legal team and the people who were supporting him to say his side of the story and defend himself in court against these two instances of discrimination. So let's see John Harris's side on the next slide here. John Harris was able to get help, possibly, from the African American Assembly Club, which is a social organization that comprised of about 160 kind of this Black middle class that we had mentioned, this community of people who was living in the city. And by August 1st, they were already being cited in newspapers that they were going to be throwing their support behind John Harris. So we know that he would have probably received support from them, possibly financially. He had a lawyer named Alfred Black that I don't know much about. I believe he was a white lawyer, but he may have been hired by the African American Assembly Club. And Alfred Black used the Dibble Civil Rights Act, which had come out only a couple of months before John Harris had actually been discriminated against at Sutro Baths. And he cited that within the precepts of the Dibble Civil Rights Act, it gives Black people, it gives people of all colors, all races, all citizens, it's a very broad thing to say, access to the same accommodation and facilities, privileges of inns, restaurants, hotels, eating houses, barbershops, anything that you can imagine of. You're supposed to go to this place and receive the same accommodation as anyone else, whether you're Black or white or Chinese or any other sort of race. And so under the precepts of the Dibble Civil Rights Act, John Harris is able to be compensated. He wins his court case, and he receives a small amount of money for each case. It was maybe like $100, I think, for each instance, so about $200 in total. It was not even really enough to pay his court fees. But what had been done, he had given teeth to the Dibble Civil Rights Act, which had actually been created by a Republican assemblyman from the South, who had always tried to help out Black communities even back there. And when he came to San Francisco, he was doing the same. But he was oftentimes encouraged and pressured by these groups like the African American Assembly Club and the Afro-American League in these colored conventions. Even before Black people could vote, they were already influencing politics by getting together, telling their legislators, you need to help us out with this, our community needs to grow with this, but also participating in what are called test cases. So these test cases test the limit of a law. The Dibble Civil Rights Act needed to be given teeth. It needed to be able to defend the people that it was intended to defend. So John Harris, defending himself in a court of law with the help of his community, gave this law what it needed to be effective. The Dibble Civil Rights Act stayed on the books until 1959, when it was transferred to be the Unruh Civil Rights Act, which expanded that definition of all citizens to also include sex, race, color, religion, ancestry, national origin, disability, medical condition, genetic information, and many other things. And the thing is that other marginalized groups were able to add on to these laws over and over again, so they're constantly being improved. So this legacy of test cases, I think, really stands out as a testament to the early civil rights movement here in San Francisco. And the fact that when we start to set back the timeline on civil rights, we can understand that people have been fighting against discrimination even during the Civil War. You know, while other Black people were still enslaved in other parts of the United States as well. So I hope it expands your narrative a little bit more. I hope we've been able to kind of take a view into what the Black community looked like in San Francisco. And I'd like to toss it back over to Alanna Smith as well, where she's going to be explaining to us what did discrimination look like for Buffalo Soldiers, and maybe what resistance looked like for Buffalo Soldiers as well.
Great. Thank you, Hector. So yeah, we're going to now take a look at a story that is closely tied to the Presidio, but it also connects nationwide to Black Americans and those efforts of resistance. And so, of course, I'm talking about the story of the Buffalo Soldiers. Now, the Presidio of San Francisco has been a military fort since before the city was in existence, so backdating to Spanish rule. And in the late 1800s, this is where Buffalo soldiers lived. And they would live in the Presidio, they worked in the Presidio, took care of their horses there. And then today, about 400 Buffalo soldiers are buried at the San Francisco National Cemetery. So these photos here on the left, we have a photo of the 9th Cavalry that's here in the Presidio. And then we have a photo of the stables. Now, these stables were built just a few years after the Buffalo Soldiers were here, but both at the stables and at the cemetery, those are two places where we hold Buffalo Soldiers programs. And these are areas where we can really reflect on the connection of people to place and really think about the experience of the Buffalo Soldiers. So let's go to the next slide, please. And so I personally did not learn about the Buffalo Soldiers in school. So this is a chapter of history that's left out of a lot of textbooks and left out of a lot of curriculums. And so I just want to do a little bit of an overview on who the Buffalo Soldiers were and what were their main duties. So after the Civil War, Black American men were allowed to join the US Army in separate segregated troops from their white counterparts. And so it was the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and the 25th Infantry. And so the first duty of the Buffalo Soldiers was to fight in the Indian Wars. And so this is a time when settlers were moving out west and were running into conflict with the Native American tribes that were trying to defend their land from these newcomers. And so the US Army wanted to, quote unquote, keep the peace, and so sent troops out there. And so the Buffalo Soldiers engaged in battle with Native Americans, against the Native Americans. But this is where we get the name Buffalo Soldiers from. So it's believed that the Native American tribes saw the hair of the Buffalo Soldiers and compared it to the fur of the buffalo, or the animal known as the bison. And so that really became a symbol that was embraced by the Buffalo Soldiers, and it showed up on their uniforms as part of their patches. And so this drawing here is by Frederick Remington, called The New Sign Language. And Frederick Remington joined the Buffalo Soldiers for a lot of their daily life. He witnessed a lot of the battles and documented. He made many, many sketches that really give us a glimpse of what that would have looked like. So in addition to the Indian Wars, Buffalo Soldiers also served in international wars. And so the earliest of those were the Spanish-American War, starting in 1898, and then shortly after the Philippine War. And then the third duty that is not really as well known is that the Buffalo Soldiers were among the first park rangers. So before the National Park Service was established, the Army were the park rangers. And so the Buffalo Soldiers would spend winters in the Presidio, and in the summertime, they would travel to Yosemite National Park and Sequoia National Park and served as park rangers. So now we know kind of what they were doing. It's really important to talk about the motivation. So that's before we get into what the resistance looked like. And so we have two quotes here that really explain why Black Americans wanted to join the Buffalo Soldiers in the first place. And so by T.G. Stewart, a chaplain with the 25th Infantry, he said, "I believe this war will very greatly help the American colored man of the South and result in the further clearing of the national atmosphere." And then from Johnny Lewis of the 10th Cavalry, He said that it is time that every patriot-hearted young colored man should come to the front and defend this honor and show that we are true American citizens, that we can protect our homes and government. And so these quotes really demonstrate kind of this optimism behind this service. So really hoping that the situation for Black Americans would improve, that they could kind of prove themselves and be embraced as Americans. And so there were also other motivations that included, the opportunity to make money, the opportunity to travel, learning new skills, like how to use a weapon, how to defend themselves. And so these are all reasons and motivations that draws people of color into the military today. So can we go to the next slide, please? Now, while many Black Americans saw this as a great opportunity and wanted to join the Buffalo Soldiers, there was also people were speaking out against this, and people in the greater Black community, so not in the military. And so I want to start with Ida B. Wells, who, she's, a well-known civil rights activist. She was also a journalist. And so she said that Negroes should oppose expansionism until the government can protect the Negro at home. She said this in 1899. And so she had a major campaign against lynching. She experienced she had friends who were victims of lynch mobs. And so she was speaking from a perspective where she was witnessing the violence that was happening for Black Americans at the time. So in her view, she didn't understand why Black Americans would want to join in on these wars when it was such a dangerous climate at home for them. And so next slide, please. We have also John Mitchell Jr., and he was an editor of a Black newspaper called the Richmond Planet. And he said, separate colored brigades means separate colored officers. No officers, no fight. And so what he's targeting in this quote is the white officers of the Buffalo Soldiers. And so in our next slide, we have a picture that shows officers of the 25th Infantry in 1901. And you look, and there is just one Black officer out of, I don't know, it's about 14 or so. And at the time, the US Army didn't believe that Black Americans were capable of positions of leadership. And this really was part of an ongoing, long-running narrative that Black Americans are less capable than their white counterparts in a lot of different ways. And we also saw that, resurface again around the World Wars, where it was believed that Black Americans were not capable of being pilots. And then that was proven wrong by the Tuskegee Airmen. And so people were really speaking out at this time that here the Buffalo Soldiers were making sacrifices and serving their country, but they were not trusted to be Black officers. And we have a quote here from a member of the 10th Cavalry who says, "Mr. Editor, will the time ever come when the colored soldiers will be treated as men? The white officers who have that hatred against the colored soldiers should sever their connections with the colored regiment." And so we get this quote. This is from, I want to shout out a really great book that provides important primary resources. It's called Smoked Yankees and the Struggle for Empire, Letters from Negro Soldiers. And so this is how we get so much of the information that we have about how the Buffalo Soldiers were feeling about their experiences in the military. And, the experiences run a large range. But so in this quote, we're seeing some of that disenchantment of, the white officers were not treating the Buffalo Soldiers well, and the Buffalo Soldiers were not able to be promoted easily. So in our next slide, please. We can see we have a newspaper clipping. The title is "Colored Troops Rebel." And I do want to point out that this is referring to the 6th Virginia Companies. So this is a volunteer regiment, so outside of the main 4 Buffalo Soldier regiments. But it does still really illustrate what it was like to be a Black member of the military at the time. And so part of this article is saying that, that the men in these companies commanded by these white officers were refusing to drill and subsequently refusing to do police duty. And so that shows that not only was there emotional resistance that was demonstrated by the Buffalo Soldiers who were writing letters to editors, but there was also some physical acts of resistance. Can we go to our next slide, please? So while many Buffalo Soldiers and members, outside of the military had some disenchantment over military service because of the lack of promotion opportunities and the white officers, there was also at least one other really major reason why there was some resistance. And that had to do with this moral dilemma of Buffalo Soldiers who were going abroad to fight, particularly in the Philippines. And they were faced with fighting a group of people who they identified with racially, the Filipinos, and they also identified with their struggle for freedom and independence. So we have this quote by Patrick Mason, who was in the 24th Infantry. He says, "I have not had any fighting to do since I have been here, and I don't care to do any. I feel sorry for these people, the Filipinos, and all that have come under control of the United States. I don't believe they will be justly dealt by." So we start to see that there is empathy that is coming from Black American soldiers when they get over to the Philippines and they see the atrocities over there, and they see that the Filipinos are suffering from the same kind of racism that they experience back home in America. And so it doesn't sit well with them that they are, joining the American military to really oppress these people. And so the Philippine Army actually started to point this out and would say, why would you want to join the American Army and fight against us? Why don't you come over to our side and join us in fighting for freedom? We see how your country treats you. Come join us. And several Buffalo Soldiers did just that. So some defected and just, didn't want to fight. They, married Filipino wives, and some stayed in the Philippines. But there were some who not only left their troops, but they then joined the Philippine Revolutionary Army and fought against the American troops. And the most well-known of those was David Fagan. So he was originally in the 24th Infantry of the US Army. And then he ended up abandoning his post, and he joined the Philippine Revolutionary Army, and he fought. And there was a bounty on his head. We don't really know what ended up happening to him, which is really, really a difficult thing. We don't know if he was captured and killed. We don't know. There's rumors that he escaped into the mountains. And so there's really, nobody knows. And I do also want to make clear that we don't have documentation of his motivations. We don't have letters from him or anything like that. So we can only kind of make theories as to what could have, made him abandon his troops and join the other side. But we can definitely come up with some theories, and we know that he wasn't the only one who did that. So I think that is the end of our slides. So if we could stop share. All right, thank you. So when we look back at the narratives that we discussed today, we can really look back on those roots of resistance that we discussed. There was the media. So we saw that was a really important method of broadcasting different perspectives, broadcasting the letters of the Buffalo Soldiers and different opinions. We also saw legal representation had a major role. And that really gave hope to Black Americans that these anti-discrimination laws would be upheld and that there was hope for the future, basically. There was the business and the financing, which really kind of supported all these efforts. And then there was also the community organizing, and that looked like a lot of different things. So that could be, organizations like the Afro-American League, but that could also be kind of less organized efforts. But it was all about the Black community coming together to support each other and to make those acts of resistance have more impact. And so now that we see those kind of early methods of resistance, we can kind of think about, the movements today, like the Black Lives Matter movement, and how does resistance play out today? And we see some of those same forms of resistance, just kind of in updated methods. So, we see communication through social media. We see the forming of, nationwide organizations that help to bring the Black community together. And then also we're seeing solidarity from other groups coming in as well. As far as, legal representation, we saw, especially last year, we saw Black law firms coming together to support legal cases. And then we also see individual acts of resistance that, sometimes they make headlines. So what this all tells us is that, we're still seeing these acts of resistance, and the fight for equality is not something that's ever done or ever completed. It's something that continues, and it evolves over time. And there's new forms of resistance that come to meet up with these, updated continuing threats to equality and threats to justice. So I think that's all I had. Hector, did you want to add anything?
No, I don't think it could be better said than that. Acknowledging the fact that there is still so much more work that communities are doing here as well is really important. In the Bay View, people are fighting for environmental justice. People in the Western Addition and other places are fighting against gentrification. The struggles look very different, but once again, like, a fight worth fighting is a life worth living. For me, is that in Black History Month, I think there's a lot of a focus on like the struggle, but like, we wanted to go over some of the fruits of the struggle, right? Like, what is, what is at the end of the tunnel? And as Alanna picked up, like, equality, it's a constant back and forth, but things move along slowly. So it looks like we have some questions coming in, Alanna.
Yeah. Let's see. I don't know if there's an order.
I answered one of the other ones. The first one was a question that someone asked that was just, why did the Unrest Civil Rights Act have to be made? And I kind of answered it with, what was the expansion of that all in the Dibble Civil Rights Act, when we start to name those sorts of protected classes are very clearly defined, of like sexual orientation, race. We start to name these classes that can't be discriminated against, then it's easier to interpret that law, and lawyers can't argue over what does all mean, because we have a very clear definition. So I answered that in the chat. Looks like you have a question.
Yeah, so the question is, do we know if the first Buffalo Soldier barracks were located on base at the Presidio? I have heard that their original barracks is a building near Fillmore and Golden Gate Avenue. And that's from Gary. So I am not sure about the very first barracks. I just know about the ones that were located kind of near the parade ground today, but I don't know where the very first ones were located. So that's a great question, and one that I will be looking into, because I'm curious to know myself. So thank you. Okay, so another one is, are there any sites in GGNRA named for any of the Buffalo Soldiers? I don't think there are any named for the Buffalo Soldiers, and correct me, Hector, if you think of one. I don't know of any sites, just that the National Cemetery has the Buffalo Soldiers buried there, but I don't know of any Buffalo Soldier named sites that we have here. Okay. Did any of the Buffalo Soldiers wind up helping the Native Americans like they did the Filipinos? That's a great question. And there's not a whole lot of documentation that I found about that, but I do know that there were a lot of Black Americans who did join Native American tribes and were fully embraced the Native American tribes. And there were also some Buffalo Soldiers who were descended from both Black Americans and from Native American tribes. So while there's not the documentation, because the letters that we read that are available, those are mainly dating from around the Philippine American War, the Spanish American War. And so we don't really have any from, the 1860s and 1870s. But I would, love to hear if there are any, documented stories of Buffalo Soldiers joining the Native Americans in those
fights. It's a very hard question too, as well, because we need to understand that, Buffalo Soldiers were not immune to the discrimination that was systemic at the time. So we have like the ways that, some of the quotes that Alanna didn't include were the ways that Buffalo Soldiers perceived of the Filipinos as being sort of this foreign enemy and, having prejudiced beliefs against them as well. And I know that I've read some material that points that, Buffalo Soldiers did have prejudiced attitudes towards Native people and Filipinos. So it really depends on who you're talking about, right? So Alanna brought up some of these ideas of like when we've seen this unity, but there were a lot of different Buffalo Soldiers. There were a lot of different people throughout history, and there's always examples of that disunity as well. So
absolutely, that's really important. Thanks for bringing that up, Hector. Yeah. Oh, hey, Leilani.
I know, yeah, I see a lot of these folks in here.
Yay, let's see, what else? Ooh, and Elaine is here. Yay, great. And Mike, yeah, thanks for joining, everybody.
Bring them in, y'all. Ask some questions. We're always willing to respond.
Yeah, I'm trying to look through, make sure we didn't miss any other ones. Ooh, cool. Excellent. Yeah, thanks for sharing all these comments. This is great.
I'm from New Orleans, so it's great to learn about SF history. I want to learn about New Orleans history. I'm trying to work over there. It's really like interesting, especially. Cool. All right.
All right. Well, thank you everyone very much for joining us today and for participating. And
it looks like we have one question from Michael Evans that hasn't made it over to our Zoom chat.
I guess we do have a little bit of a delay, maybe.
Michael, here it is. Michael is asking, is it safe to assume that after the Harris v. Sutro Baths decision, the Sutro Baths changed their discriminatory practices? I believe that there was a case that came out, if I can look it up really quickly here in my emails, that actually there was Chinese people who were getting discriminated against at Sutro Baths as well. And that was sent out from Elaine Ellenson. So, not everybody that would get discriminated against would necessarily sue in a court of law. And that's kind of one of the best ways that we get evidence of things. So let me see here. So Elaine had sent us an article a little while ago. That says Chinese awarded damages for exclusion from public bath. And so this was in 1938. So, we're going forward. Sutro Baths was active until the middle of the 20th century, like 1950, something like that. And by 1938, there were still, Chinese people or other people of color who were being turned away from the baths. And they actually were able to use the Dibble Civil Rights Act, according to this newspaper article from the time. It was a Boy Scout group that was able to receive an award for damages from exclusion for the bath. So discrimination still happened. That's, again, that kind of points to the importance of expanding that all. Just because a law exists doesn't mean that it is going to be defended. It doesn't mean that it's always going to be used. So, yeah.
Ooh. Let's see, given the documentation practices of the U.S. military, why are there no records of what happened to John Fagan or David Fagan? So the reason there's not a documentation of it is because he wasn't captured. There was a bounty on his head. And at some point, somebody came in with a severed head and said, this is David Fagan, but that was never confirmed. And that could have just been somebody trying to collect collect the money. So that, that was never really documented. And so it's, it's kind of, it's hard to know what did happen to him, but there was never a record of saying we definitely have David Fagan. So it's really kind of anybody's guess. And I would love to know what ended up happening. This is such a big mystery. Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks.
That's right, Vicky. Mary Ellen Pleasant is a very interesting woman. So I tried not to talk about her for too long so we could kind of focus on the core of the program, but for sure, look her up. I would corroborate some of the sources with other sources. Generally, we try to teach people to be historians. So sometimes that means you have to check in a couple of places to see if something comes up over and over again. Because Mary Ellen Pleasant's such a fascinating woman that there's a lot of different accounts of her life. So yeah, a lot of the articles that I have mention her. And for some of the things that sounded like a little bit more mystical, a little bit more like maybe this might not happen, I would just corroborate a little bit as well. So, but truly a fascinating woman. Let's see.
I don't see any more questions coming in. Anybody in YouTube land have any questions left? We have a few minutes. Happy to answer.
I'm checking this little chat.
I love you encouraging folks to be historians. You see why we love the NPS partnership. You are our soulmates. Hector and Alanna, Ranger Hector, Ranger Alanna, we thank you so much for being here and sharing that information. So informative, educational, and just so important all year round.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. All right, friends in YouTube, please join us for the rest of More Than a Month and all of the rest of our program that we have all year round about important topics like this and our continued partnerships with the parks. And we'll see you next time.
That might be a presentation for question for you, Anissa. The Honeycomb asks, will there be more presentations on Black History this month?
Of course, there's so many more. And we have 2 weeks left of February and it's still packed with programs, including author talks, artist talks. We are spotlighting Rodney Ewing, who does this amazing, beautiful art, which he uses photos from our archive. We did a program called Shades of Bayview. A long time ago, we had Shades of Everything San Francisco. So community archiving, people would come in, bring their photos, we'd scan them and then make them available to our community. So he has developed a whole beautiful art using these photos. So there's so much more. Check out our page where you can Google SFPL More Than a Month and you'll find out. All right, friends. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Bye, y'all.